Here. Awesome. So yeah, in this class, we focus specifically on logical reasoning, and it is a mix of difficulty leveled questions. So we'll probably have like a level one, a mid-level, and then a more higher level, level 4/level 5 at the end of class. We will try to get through all three of them. If we end up spending more time in like the first two, totally okay. We could always do the third one either after class ends or as like bonus for after class. I know Robert has a really great class at 1:30 today, so I know a lot of you are going to want to probably head to that one afterward. In this class, I really, and I know Abby really appreciates when he gets volunteers. So I want to do it in the same way. I want to elicit volunteers to go through these three questions with me. The way we like to do it is we like to have our volunteers read out loud, let us know what your thoughts are as you're reading these sentences, these words. Let us know what your opinion is. Do you think the author is full of crap? Are you kind of vibing with what they're saying? Do you think there's any conclusion in the passage? Do you think it's an argument, or do you think it's kind of just like a set of facts that we have to accept as true? So we kind of want to be disseminating out what is evidence and what are the conclusions. And then from there, we'll know kind of how to argue with the passage. So I like to just start rocking and rolling because I know it's Saturday, people are busy, there are a lot of things going on in life. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. I'm pulling our questions from the syllabus in class. If anyone needs that, I'm going to copy and paste it here in the chat for us. And before we get started with class, and I will say too, I forgot to mention this. After I have my volunteer read the passage to us, I want them to like make their predictions for the class of what they think is like wrong with the argument, or what they took away from the passage. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to look at the question on their own and try to come up with what they think the correct answer choice is. I'll have you all private DM me your prediction of the correct answer choice. That way I kind of know which ones to focus on once we come back together as a class. And then I will have my volunteer go through those questions with us, and we'll kind of talk through them together. So that's kind of how the logistics of class will work today. But before we get started on our first question, wanted to see, I know we have like a mix of students in this class. Some are newer to their journey. Some have been LSAT solvers for a while. So just want to pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions related to logical reasoning before we get kicked off on our first question. And also think about if you want to volunteer for this first one too. Nice. Okay. Okay. Maybe we'll think of some questions along the way. Totally fine. I will also say too, for the purposes of teaching today, I don't know if Abby typically tells you what question types these are going to be before he jumps into it, but I will tell you just so that way you know like some of the things that we're looking for and kind of strategizing on as a class together to help learn. Now, you should not be reading the question before you tackle the passage. So I want to let you all make that very clear here. But again, for the purposes of teaching today, I will let you know that these are either going to be a supported type question or they're going to be strengtheners. On my own LSAT journey, I will be completely honest and candid with you all, and humble myself and say that I was horrible at strengthen and weaken questions. I don't know what it is about them. I'm still kind of honestly like bad to them to this day. Like when I have them in class or when I have a tutoring student request like a strengthen or weaken, I like start to sweat a little bit. I'm like, oh gosh, okay, let's see like what we're gonna get here. So I learn with you all when I do these classes. So we're gonna get some strengtheners here. I think the reason why they can be kind of tough for me is because Even if you make a prediction, like the correct answer choice could literally be anything. And also, with strengthen and weaken, it's like they could strengthen it just a little tiny bit or weaken just a little bit tiny bit. And it's like that ends up being the prettiest and the ugly contest. So sometimes the right answer isn't as glaringly obvious as maybe some other question types are. So we'll kind of see that along the way here. And because we did not get Abby in class today, I am actually going to link a really great podcast episode that he did on LSAT Demon Daily, where he talks about how to tackle supported questions. So please take a look at that when you get a chance. I believe it was Abby and Stuart that got together and made a really great podcast episode on that if you find yourself sometimes struggling with the supported question types. And then for strengthen, our very own Abigail, she's a master tutor here at the LSAT. She wrote a really great article a few years ago on how to solve strengthen questions that admittedly, I probably do need to spend more time reading. I think when I was in my LSAT journey, I was just so like, balls to the wall on like, I just want to get to the questions. And sometimes I didn't always pay attention to like the very helpful blog posts that we have and just hearing from like different tutors and teachers on how they approach different question types. So I do highly encourage you all to kind of take a look at this blog post. And of course, come back to class and ask any follow-up questions that you may have on it, but just some supplemental kind of readings and listenings to help accommodate what we're going to learn in class today. All right, enough of my BS. Do I have a volunteer to go through our first question? Oh, and before I get started, Amelia, I don't know if you're going to ask a question or if you're going to volunteer. Go ahead.
Volunteer. Go ahead.
Oh, awesome. Okay, perfect. Sounds great. All right, y'all. So we're going to start off with mid-level managers here. Again, Amelia so graciously is going to go through this passage with us. She's going to try to fight and object along the way. She's going to try to come up with predictions. We'll pause after reading and after kind of analyzing the passage together. I'll give y'all a few minutes to do the question on your own, and then we'll come back together again. Okay, Amelia?
All right, let's go.
Awesome. Sounds good. Let's get kicked off here.
Right, test 24, test 124, section 2. Mid-level managers at large corporations are unlikely to suggest reductions in staff. Okay, well, if a dude has, 4 people reporting to him, like he gets some prestige from that, in their own departments, even when these departments are obviously overstaffed. So taken as a whole, I'm guessing that there is an argument that it is that the argument is these mid-level managers are unlikely to say, we don't need Chloe anymore because she hasn't had anything to do for a month. Because of whatever reasons. Now, we don't actually have reasons given for why they're likely to keep people when they're overstaffed. So that's
Yeah.
potential weakness. I tend to agree with the basic idea, but I'm here to fight the conclusion. So that's an objection, is that we haven't been given evidence precisely for this conclusion.
Yeah, Amelia. So I actually, and that's a great call out. You just said that, hey, there really is no like conclusion here for, or there's really no evidence for this conclusion. So, and I know you had said initially you were like, hey, I think like this kind of first part right here is kind of like the conclusion of this passage. I would actually push back on you just a little bit, and right, we're here to learn. So this is an awesome like learning opportunity right here. Is that if you're kind of finding like, oh, wait, there's really no evidence like being provided, there's really no premises. It kind of just seems like the author is telling me something here. Don't try to force yourself to try to find a conclusion. If it doesn't, if the passage is not really feeling like a kind of formulaic, like we've done the LSAT like quite a bit now. I'm sure a lot of us have started to understand like when there's an actual argument, we can kind of see some evidence of that. Like there's some premises, there's typically like a bizarre ass conclusion. The author is usually spewing some BS, and we get the vibes, right? We get the feeling, okay, like, okay, yeah, this is an actual argument. The author is trying to like argue something because he wants me to believe something, right? But here, it almost just seems like the author is just giving us like some background information, almost, right? Like he's just saying, hey, like mid-level managers, like for some weird reason, they don't like to reduce their staff, even when they know that they're overstaffed. So
Mhm.
essentially, I think this sentence kind of just serves as like almost like a whole premise. Like this is just something that we know to be true about the world. And then you can pause and be like, okay, there's really nothing for me to like fight with here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I just jump into the question. You kind of
Mhm.
want to pause and be like, okay, why? Like, why could this be happening? Because, right, because it could end up being like, we know it's not going to be a paradox, but like, it could end up being a paradox where it's like, hey, which one of the following would help solve this like discrepancy? So you always want to just pause and just be like, okay, what do I know to be true? And maybe can I come up with a prediction of like why it's happening, just to force yourself to pause for a second to really make sure that you're understanding like what's actually being said.
Got it. So I maybe overanalyzed to try to find, well, this is the conclusion and this is the evidence. But if it had said corporate consultant, colon, right, then I just would have taken it as a statement, right? Um,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, hey, like, is the author trying to force me to think about something in a certain way, right? And it doesn't really seem like the author is trying to like confuse us, or like it's not like he's trying to make us feel a certain way or is trying to say, hey, you should think this thing, right? Like he's almost just kind of presenting this as like a, hey, isn't this weird, like, right, Joe, like isn't this weird that this is happening, like why are they doing this kind of a vibe, versus like, oh, like mid-level managers, they don't like to reduce their staff even when they're overstaffed, so clearly they're idiots and they should be like reducing their staff if they are, right? Like he never really went that far. He
right,
only just said, hey, this is happening.
right.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
Amelia. So it's essentially just right, like just a premise, right? That's all we know. We know this to be true about the world. So we'll see what this question asks us.
All right. So each of the following, if true, supports the claim above, except. So four of these are going to be in the vibes of what we're given, and one of them is not.
Exactly. So with supported, they're a little bit different than must be true, because in must be true questions, you are looking for what was explicitly stated in the passage and going into the answer choices and finding that thing. With
Right.
supported, there's not as high level of a bar to hit. And I think sometimes that can kind of make supported almost just like a little bit more tough than must be true, because
Mm,
must be true are very like black and white. It's either like, did the author say it or did they not, right? But with supported, it's like, yeah, maybe he didn't explicitly say this, but we can kind of get it from the context of the passage.
right.
So be mindful of this when y'all go through this question right here. But I'm gonna, Amelia, great job analyzing this one. We're gonna pause for a minute, see if you can come up with the correct answer choice. Private DM me what you think the right answer choice is. Let me know anything you were tempted by. And then Amelia, I'll call you back and then we'll go through these answer choices together. Okay.
Good.
Sweet. Thanks all.
It's still blurted out. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Maybe we can make it a little smaller so that we can see more answer. Okay, great.
Awesome, y'all. Okay, I got the majority of answer choice predictions already. If you're still kind of thinking through this one, please feel free to mute me for a second as you get done with this one. But Amelia, I'm gonna have you take it away. It looks like there was maybe one other answer choice that people were just a little bit tempted by. So when we get to that point, we'll talk about it, okay?
Sounds good. All right, so going in, I wanted a prediction. My prediction was, what if they get bonuses for reducing unnecessary staff? Which would directly contradict what would be claimed.
Yeah, I love that. Okay.
And all I really need to do, I find it easier to, in these kinds of questions, to like see which ones vibe with what we were given in the first place, and then X them out, and then whatever's left, make sure that's right.
Yes.
So, all right, so A, the compensation paid to mid-level managers is greater when they supervise more workers. Obviously, that is in line with what we've been told.
Yeah,
Stop,
it's basically
yeah,
what you predicted, right? Or what you wouldn't want the right answer to be, or like almost the opposite of what you predicted.
exactly, yeah. B, mid-level managers have less work to do when their departments are overstaffed. To be honest, I left it open my first round through because I was like, is it better to have less work or more work? I don't
Interesting.
know.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Well, it's almost like, yeah, it's almost like now you have to like, see, this is where your outside knowledge can be brought into the LSAT to help, right? Because you're like, well, comment almost like it's almost like, well, like for myself, like in the real world, like, do I want like to have more like work, like, or would I want to be able to like delegate those responsibilities out to my employees, you know? So you kind of have to go with like your common sense slash intuitive like nature here. And even if you are yourself a workaholic, try to think about generally what's true in the world, right? Like, okay, I know that most people probably don't want a shit ton of work, right? Like they probably want to be able to delegate that crap out to like their employees. So this is kind of when you can bring in that outside knowledge to help you in the LSAT, Amelia.
yeah, yeah, no, I left it open. I did get there eventually. I will put in a plug for David Graeber's amazing book, Bullshit Jobs, in which he
Mm.
basically says lots of people don't have anything to do. They're just making things work up, right? Like, and they're so that's
That's
part of
awesome.
my knowledge that I bring to this, that like maybe these mid-level managers, which were a specific example in that book, really don't have anything to do and they're tearing their hair out because they're paid a lot of money and they don't know how to look busy.
That is hilarious. And I love Ethan's comment. I am him. Yeah, I can empathize. I am her, like for real. So maybe that's why it was so easy for me to eliminate because I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah, you know.
Yeah, so we'll move on. C, staff morale and productivity often suffer when workers are laid off. Obviously, if I'm mid-level manager, man, I don't want my productivity or my people not to like me, right? I
Yeah,
need them to do their work. I need
exactly.
them to be decent to work with. Like, so nope. D, departmental workloads at most large corporations increase and decrease significantly and unpredictably. So this tells me that we don't know if we're obviously overstaffed because maybe in this quarter we have too many people, but next quarter we don't have enough.
Yes, exactly. And I want to double down on D again. And that was a great analysis too, Amelia. I'm going to double down on D because this seemed to be the one that tripped up a few people. And I should have actually
Correct.
when we were talking through this passage, I should have told you what my prediction was or like what I was maybe thinking as to why these managers like to keep extra people is I just remember like as you all probably remember too, if you were like a manager basically anywhere during COVID times, you probably dealt with the same like labor and staffing issues that I dealt with at my full-time job where it was like, "Oh my gosh, we could never keep people," right? Like one week we were super overstaffed, the next week we all of a sudden were like down seven people, right? So it's like we didn't really know like it was just the level of volatility was so high. We always wanted to try to stay overstaffed, and we literally had, like, a motto, like, "Always be staffing." We always wanted to be overstaffed in case of an event where we lost a ton of people at once. So,
Right.
basically, D is kind of doing that thing, but instead of using people as the example, it's using, like, workload, right? Where it's like, well, it ebbs and flows, like, there are sometimes we have, like, a shit ton of project, there's
Yeah,
sometimes where we don't have any, so it's like we wanna keep extra people for the times where we do have a ton of work.
exactly. Yeah, and we can
Yeah.
think of examples like if the public utility doesn't have enough linemen and you get hit by a hurricane,
Yeah. Like, you want, those people there, right? You sure as shit don't
I
want
don't
them to
want
be,
them
like,
on
working
set.
somewhere else. Exactly.
Do
Agreed.
we need to do that anymore, or are we good?
Yeah, so it's like, hey, so it's like we read, and another thing I wanna call out about, D is that someone had said, I liked D and didn't even, like, read E. So, like, they picked it and were like, "Yep, that's it," and they were donezo. But you have to be very, and this is why we always say at the Demon to always read all 5 answer choices, because it could be a situation where you really like an answer choice and either A, you misread it and didn't actually understand what it was saying, or B, you end up finding an answer choice that's even better than what you thought was the right answer choice. So always do your due diligence. I'm sure you all would not want to hire an attorney that doesn't fully read everything and just like is like, oh yeah, this seems good enough, and then just like keeps it moving and then they end up being wrong, right? Like we're humans, we're all gonna make errors and mistakes sometimes. So you wanna like write your list and then check it twice to just make sure like, all right, we're good to go. Like now I know with confidence this is the right answer choice. Let's keep it moving. And it doesn't take very long to eliminate the rest of the answer choices once you found the one that you've liked. So you always just want to make sure that you're doing that, because I have definitely bitten myself in the butt before by like picking an answer choice, moving on, and then it ended up being wrong because I like just was trying to rush, right? Like
Mhm.
I always have like a motto, like, yeah, like, be quick, but don't hurry. Like, this is kind of what you need to do on the LSAT too, is that like you want to be concise and efficient with your time, but also like you don't want to rush and make mistakes either. So, just
Exactly.
kind of keep that in mind too.
Exactly. Okay, so going back, let's refresh what the hell we're doing here because we're trying to not support this conclusion that the large corporation managers are unlikely to say we could let go of these people. Um,
Yeah.
and so E is saying many large corporations allow managers to offer early retirement as a means of reducing staff, which, if we think about it for a second, does not support the idea that they are unlikely to say, you know what, Jan's kind of getting up there and her salary's high, and we could hire two 25-year-olds for the same price, and maybe she's ready to retire because she keeps knitting, like
Yeah.
we don't have that. Um,
Yeah.
so that's why I picked E, and then I went back and worked out that B can't be right because there's a way to interpret it to say this is good for the mid-level managers because maybe they have three people's jobs that they have to do, and if they've got people that they can foist some of that stuff on, then they're happy.
Exactly. I love that, Amelia, and I love that you worked through why B ultimately ends up being wrong here, why E aligns, because it's like, hey, like if we know that these managers, like when they do let go of these employees, they can give them like an early retirement. That's like a nice bonus to have, right? Or that's like a nice incentive to be able to offer to your employees. So why is it that, yeah, like we have this really supportive and strong like pathway to bridge these people into retirement, that is, it could kind of be an anomaly, right? Like most businesses may not be able to even afford to be able to do that. Why is it then that you're still keeping all these people on board when you don't need them and they could get a nice retirement package and go on and live like the rest of their life either in retirement, or I mean, this is me bringing in some outside knowledge, but I know, like, sometimes when you give someone a retirement package, they can still go on and work somewhere else and still get those retirement benefits too. This is from me coming from an HR background. So but yeah, E ends up being the correct answer here. So awesome job, Amelia. Thank you for going through this passage with us. Any questions on this one before we move on to our second question of the day? Let's submit, make sure we're right. Awesome. All right, y'all. We will be going to our second question of the day. It's called documentary. Oh my gosh, documentary films. I'm not saying that right. Sometimes I'm not good with words. I apologize. Do I have someone who would like to volunteer for the second question of the day? And remember, it's either going to be a supporter or strengthening. Paul, awesome job. Thank you for volunteering. We're going to do the exact same thing that Amelia just did. Just by kind of looking at the blurred background, it looks like this one's going to be a little bit of a longer passage. So we may have to spend just a little bit more time kind of, piercing through this one, just making sure that we're understanding everything along the way and identifying if there are premises or conclusion here, or if it's just like a set of facts. Okay. Awesome. This is test 122, question 19, and it's called documentary documentary films. All right, Paul, take it away.
All right. This is coming from a film critic. There has been a recent spate of so-called documentary films purporting to give the true story of one historical event or another. The first thing that leaps out to me is spate. I'm unclear on what that word is from the top of the head knowledge, but from context, I'm going to assume it means a whole lot of them or
Yeah.
almost none of them. And I'm kind of leaning towards a whole lot of them.
Okay.
And also just huge attitude, quotes around documentary films and purporting to do a true story. So I'm already thinking that this film critic is not particularly convinced of the merit of these films.
Yeah.
So
Agreed.
just holding that in my head and moving on to the next sentence.
Okay.
But yeah, most of these films have been inaccurate and filled with speculations. Usually, well, I'll stop at the comma. Filled with speculations already. That's kind of confirming my belief that this is not a particularly positive assessment of the films. Usually about conspiracies. Okay. Yeah. So we're trying to argue that these films are not great.
Yeah.
The filmmakers defend their works by claiming that freedom of speech entitles them to express their views. Okay, this is how the filmmakers are justifying their creation of the films. And so I'm assuming we're going to attack that specifically in the following sentences. Although that claim is true, it does not support the conclusion that anyone ought to pay attention to the absurd views expressed in the films. Okay, so one thing I'm going to look out for is in the answer choices is whether or not the claim of free speech is true is not going to change the support or subtraction from this critic's argument, because they are conceding that point. And the real crux of their argument is that it does not support the conclusion that anyone ought to pay attention to the absurd views expressed in the films. So what I'm going to be looking for is some kind of principle that that states that absurd views shouldn't be paid attention to. That's kind of where my mindset's at.
Yeah, Paul, great job analyzing this one. And I love how you picked up on the tone of the film critic right away. And that he was being a little sassy right off the start, like, oh, like there's been a reason. And even though you didn't know what spate meant, I don't know what spate means either, but it's like, it almost is overshadowed by like these really strong like tonal words that the author uses, like, oh, these so-called documentaries where it's like they're purporting these things, like these so-called things, right? Like, yeah, right, like true story, my ass, is kind of like the vibe that he has here. And then he says, "Hey, but you know what? Most of these films here, like they're inaccurate. They're filled with these wild speculations about like these conspiracies." So the critic is just like not about it. And then he starts to tell us why these filmmakers are doing what they do, and they are arguing that, hey, it's my free speech right to be able to say whatever the hell I want in these films. And you that was a great call out, Paul, where you were like, you know what? When we get into whatever question this is about to ask me, I know for a fact that this claim, this whole freedom of speech thing, I can't fight against that, right? Like I can't be like, oh, well, freedom of speech, like, but if you know you're lying, like, is that really freedom of speech? Like we can't, let's not even like go down that rabbit hole, because we know for a fact that these filmmakers are entitled to their freedom of speech, and their films fall under the freedom of speech umbrella. So I thought that was a great call out there, that the film critic does seem to give some sort of concession here to the film critics. But he's like, but nevertheless, I don't care if it's freedom of speech. Like, I don't think people should be paying attention to you because like you have such absurd views in these like crappy films. So that is essentially what this film critic is trying to argue here, is that, hey, I don't think that the public should even pay attention to you because of these wild things that you're saying in your documentary, even if it is your freedom of speech to be able to do that. So yeah, awesome job, Paul. And Sam, yeah, I saw that you had a question.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, so would the flaw in this passage be that the film critic is dismissing the filmmaker's argument based off the fact that they're um, I don't know like exactly how to put it into words, but he's kind of going after the film critics versus like evaluating or assessing the entire situation as a whole. Would that be the flaw?
Oh, you're saying like maybe as a like an ad hominem attack, like
Yeah,
he is
yes, yes.
attacking the film critic. Not necessarily, because ad hominem attacks on the LSAT are like, they're kind of weird. They don't really come up that often in the LSAT. I think they're almost like kind of like circular reasoning flaws, in that it's like when it's happening, it's like almost really obvious that it's happening, and like the LSAT doesn't like to be obvious because they probably think that is like too easy. So very rarely will you see a flaw of like an ad hominem attack in the LSAT itself. I think in order for this to be like an ad hominem attack, uh it would more so have to be this film critic attacking who these filmmakers are as like people in just the world, instead of attacking like the factual accuracies of their films. So it seems like this film critic is on some level giving us some evidence of, hey, like these are just wild speculations. We don't really know what actually happened in history. There are conspiracies about like, they are conspiracies that are being brought up in these films. So he's not necessarily attacking the filmmakers and saying, hey, like, well, you cheated on your wife, so like we can't trust anything that y'all say, right? Like that's not necessarily what he's doing. He's more so attacking like, hey, you guys aren't bringing facts to your films, and therefore we shouldn't listen to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was trying to find the mute button. But the reason I brought
Yeah.
that up was because of his last sentence. He used the word absurd
Yeah.
views. So that's kind of
Yeah.
why I was like, is this ad hominem? Not sure.
That's actually a great call out. And I think, Sam, you're getting to a much deeper problem here in this passage. And it's not something that we've talked about yet, but just because we're kind of vibing with what this film critic is saying, his conclusion here is not necessarily it's not like sufficient. He hasn't necessarily proven his conclusion true, Because why can't we pay attention to absurd views in films, right? Like, what's it to you, film critic? Like, why are we not allowed to pay attention, like, to it? Like, you haven't told us a premise that states, like, hey, like, if there are any things that are being said in the world that have not been factually proven true, we should not pay attention to those things. So, Sam, I like that you have brought this question up because it forces us to think about, well, like, what's the problem here, right? Like, what is this film critic doing wrong in his argument? And it's that he hasn't really proven to us why we can't pay attention, even if these films are absurd. So, exactly, Sam. So this is what is wrong with the passage. The author hasn't really filled the gap between the premises of like, yeah, okay, we grant that these are conspiracies, we grant that these aren't necessarily true stories, but that doesn't mean still that we can't pay attention to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, of course. Great. Okay. Any other questions on this one before we go into the question itself? Awesome. Okay, Paul. And thank you, Paul, too, for your analysis of this one. I'm going to have you read this question aloud to us, and then we'll pause and we will look at the answer choices, and then we'll come back together again. Okay.
Okay, to which one of the following principles does the film critic's commentary most closely conform? And so, should I give a quick prediction or?
What type of question do you think this is?
It's supported by like a principle. I'm not sure the exact terminology to use.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to ask you because I think this sometimes when people see this word, they get a little tripped up. Like, what's a principle? Like, what does that mean on the LSAT? It's almost see this question is a little weird. It could be viewed as a supported. Sometimes, though, the way I like to think about them is I almost like to think of them as like a strengthen because oh my gosh, I'm sorry, y'all. My cat's tail is literally like right in front of the camera. This one, it's almost like, hey, what rule is the author following to make his conclusion? So it's almost like if the author were to follow this rule, like, does his conclusion make a little more sense? So you can think of it almost as like a strength in. I think it's totally okay too to think of it almost as like a supported because we are kind of pulling what the author said in the passage to help us find the right answer choice. So I almost kind of like to think of it as almost like a mix between like a supported and a strengthen. And I know it's not like we don't have like a specific question type for principal questions. But sometimes that does kind of help me as I'm going through the answer choices. So A, we want to look back at what the author concluded, right? And B, we want to see if the answer choice kind of falls in line with what he was saying and if it would almost even like bolster his conclusion a little bit if we knew it to be true.
Mhm.
Awesome. Okay. Let me Paul, we're gonna give everyone a few minutes here to look at this one on their own. Again, private DM me y'all what you think the right answer choice is if you were stuck on anything, and then we will come back together again, okay? All right, I'll give y'all a few. Okay. We are gonna come back together again. It looks like there was actually a mix of predictions here. If you're still finishing out this one, please feel free to mute us. But Paul, I'm gonna have you go through each answer choice here. I may double down just a little bit on the ones that I got questions in the chat about people who were maybe a little tempted by those. But again, reread the question to us. Give us maybe what your light prediction is, and then we'll start tackling each one, okay?
So my light prediction was just something that would support that we ought not pay attention to absurd views.
Yes. Love it.
And I felt like there was a few answers that kind of conformed to that prediction, so it was a little tricky for me. Maybe it was too broad
Okay.
of a prediction to start with, but starting with A, although filmmakers are entitled to express absurd views, they are not justified in doing so. And I for that tripped me up for just a second, just because it concedes that people are entitled to express it, but then I realized that not justified wasn't really part of the argument. It was about whether or not someone ought to or ought not to pay attention. And
Ex
so, like at first, it seemed okay, and then I thought, no, that's a non sequitur. That's not relating to the conclusion. So I
exactly.
eliminated that one.
Love it. And this one seemed to be one that were a lot of people were tempted by. It's not that the film critic is trying to say like, hey, these filmmakers are justified or not justified in what they do. It's more so that he's saying we just shouldn't pay attention to their BS, like whether they're justified. And it's almost like he's saying like they are somewhat justified in a way, because he does say that like they are entitled to their free speech, right? Like they're entitled to say whatever they want in their films, but we still should not listen to what they're saying, because it's like they're spewing BS to us. So A goes too far. I like the first part of A, but the last part goes too far because, like you said, Paul, the film critic isn't necessarily arguing whether these filmmakers are justified or not. It's just that we shouldn't pay attention to them.
One other thing with that is like, what's the difference between entitled and justified? It seems like it's just
Yeah.
saying you can't do this, but you can do this. And I was just like,
Yeah.
I think it's
Exactly.
just
It's almost
circular
like
in here,
a
and I think it's just there to
contradiction.
confuse me.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, it tripped me up for a second. Everyone ought to ignore films containing wild speculations about conspiracies. I was a little optimistic about this one, but the first thing that I saw was everyone, and I was just like, that is a lot. So I actually left that one open to myself for a second, and
Yeah.
moved on to the other choices just because I was like, maybe, but I was not optimistic. But
Yeah.
I was
I
like, potential. It had
yeah.
potential. I was kind of
Okay.
with
Well,
a lot of these answers. I thought, oh, they look okay.
yeah, right. Yeah, this one is kind of a hard one. I think this one's it ends up being maybe like level 2 or 3, but I, like you all, was reading through these and I'm like, "Oh, I kind of like that. Oh, I kind of like that." I'm like, "Oh, wait. Why am I kind of liking a little bit of something about all of these?" Like it was a weird feeling. I'm like, "Oh, crap." So, we can leave be open and then we'll go to C, okay?
I could say I did eventually close it out. I could explain how I killed the
Yeah,
question
okay.
eventually. All right.
Explain to us what you liked it at first, but then ultimately you were like, "Oh, no, I don't like it." So what didn't you like about it?
Once I found what I thought was the right answer, I came back to this and I looked at it and said that anyone ought to pay. It does not support the conclusion that anyone ought to pay attention to it, but that is just saying that like no single person ought to pay attention to it, and that doesn't go all the way to say that everyone ought not to.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
this is something that the LSAT likes to do a lot, that ends up being a wrong answer choice, especially on like those supported type of like must be true questions, is that like it will take what the author said and blow it out of proportion. And that's what B ends up doing. Cause remember here, like we're kind of living in like a vacuum when we read these passages. These authors are kind of living in their own little bubble, their own little sphere, and they'll give us like an example or they'll start like complaining about something specific, And we will think that they mean it to mean generally in life, we should think this thing. But remember here, these authors are kind of living in a vacuum, and especially here where this film critic is especially heated about specific films, right? He's not saying like, hey, in general, people should never listen to films where there's conspiracy theories. He is just saying that for these specific films that I'm bringing up, we should not pay attention to them. So B ends up being too strong. And like Paul just said, because of the everyone here, we don't know if he actually thinks that about like all films and life in general. We only know about the specific examples that he brought up in this passage.
Yeah. So, moving on to freedom of speech sometimes makes the expression of absurd views necessary. The second I read the freedom of speech, I was like, oh no, no
Yeah.
chance. And then also the following parts of it weren't really convincing either. It makes the
Yeah.
expression of absurd views necessary. That's like totally opposite of what the
Yeah.
author's after. That one was pretty quick to go away.
Nice. And I love that you took the time in the passage to be like, nope, I'm not going to get tripped up if an answer choice says that.
All right, D, freedom of speech once more. I was not optimistic. Freedom of speech does not entitle filmmakers to present inaccurate speculations as truth, which is also contradicted in the passage where he says, you can say what you want, but we don't have to pay attention to you. So that was, again, just gone.
Yep,
Uh,
exactly. Love it.
And that left me with E. Views that people are entitled to express need not be views which anyone is obliged to pay attention to. And so that was a little bit wordy at first, and I had when I got to that, I still had B open, so I was kind of like, well, what does that actually mean? But once I went through it and thought about it for a little bit, it was that views need not be, or uh, views that people are entitled to express need not be views to which anyone is obliged to pay attention to. And then that tracked to does not support the conclusion that anyone ought to pay attention. They need not pay attention. Uh,
Yeah.
and so
So
that's why I chose E.
love it. Need not is basically ought, right? Like basically. So it's like, and yeah, they word E in a really like ambiguous and kind of weirdly worded way to I think kind of trip you up a little bit, especially because there were some other ones that were a little tempting. But yeah, essentially this is basically conforms perfectly to what the author is saying, because it's like, hey, yeah, you can have your freedom of speech. That doesn't mean that we need to pay attention to you. So that's essentially what the author was saying in his conclusion, and that is exactly like what E is saying here. And yeah, great job, Paul, because I know there were some that like, yeah, like be like, wait, okay, what is B saying, right? Compared to like E. And B essentially it ends up being just a little too strong. It's like, ooh, is that really what he was trying to say? Like it almost kind of gives you a little bit of like an icky feeling, like could I say like 100% that like the author would agree with me if I were to be like, yep, that's like what he thinks, right? But like with E, it's like, okay, yeah, that's essentially what he's saying, and even in an even more shitty way. So
Yeah.
exactly. Awesome job, Paul. Thank you so much for volunteering with a tricky mid-level passage, I would say. The passage itself wasn't too crazy to understand, but the answer choices were definitely they were tricky for sure. Great. Anyone have any other questions on this one before we go to our last question of the day? Awesome. Okay. This one's probably going to be just a little bit more difficult, but nevertheless we're going to get through it just the same. And Ethan, I saw that you bravely raised your hand here. I assume you're volunteering unless you have a question. If you're volunteering or if you have a question, just let me know. But this one is from test 124. It's question 19 and it's called renting cars.
Test 124, section 2. Renting cars from dealerships is less expensive than renting cars from national rental firms. But to take advantage of dealership rates, tourists must determine which local dealerships offer rentals and then pay for long taxi rides between the airport and those dealerships, specifying specifically the local dealerships. So renting from dealerships rather than national rental firms is generally more worthwhile for local residents and for tourists. So, wait, does everybody hear me right now? My
Yes,
audio
we can
stuff?
hear you.
Okay.
Yes, you're
Just
just reading really, really quick.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so,
Sorry about that. Sorry. About
No, it's okay.
no worries, Ethan. So if I were to move away from this passage for a second, and I do this with my tutor and students too, could you tell me what you just read and what the author's argument was?
The author is, or the person in this section is trying to argue that going to local dealerships to rent a car is more viable for people who are local residents than for tourists, and is trying to say that at least within the passage, renting cars from a national rental firm typically is going to be the more viable option for a tourist because they don't have the knowledge that a local resident will have. And then on top of that, the potential ride fare to get to the local dealership may be tricky because of the
Yeah.
paywall or schedule distance.
Yeah, that's essentially is what he's trying to say. I'm impressed actually, because you did read that pretty quickly, and I was gonna be like, whoa, did he even like comprehend what he was just
I
reading?
will I will say I did uh, towards the end of the last question, I did give this one a little bit of a go
Oh,
ahead.
of a pre-read. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So you cheated a little bit. No, I'm just kidding, Ethan. I see you're a Michigan fan, so I got to give you some shit since I'm a Buckeye. Okay, okay. So yeah, and just in general, y'all, and you know, we always say this at the Demon to take it slow, take it as slow as you need to. Sparse out each sentence bit by bit and really try to comprehend what the author is saying. And not only just like not only for the comprehension, but also see if you can figure out where you think he's gonna go next, and if you can start to call bullshit on it. We want to try to be as proactive in the passage as possible. When we become proactive in that way, we can start to honestly predict the right answer choice before we even before we even finish reading the passage, honestly. So, just I think a good piece of advice for everyone to take away here. And I think, and I apologize, in the middle of my spiel, I think someone may have had a question. Was it Victoria? Did you have a question?
I had my hand up only because I seen the screen went to the last question,
Oh, yeah.
and then I just wanted to confirm that the last question, the answer was E, not B, because it looked like, yeah, okay, good.
Yep,
Thank
yep,
you.
sorry, it was E there.
Can he reread that first just one more time? Or I mean, because he did a great
Yeah.
job, but just for I read the questions usually more than once. And so I guess I didn't catch it because he was going so quick, which is, I'm not
Yeah.
trying to be disrespectful. It's just for
N
me to try to get the answer right.
No, no, and thank you for bringing that up, Victoria. And, when you just said I tend to have to reread a passage over again, we wanna try to avoid that by going as slow as we need to within the passage, versus reading the whole thing and then being like, okay, wait, I need to reread this whole thing all over again. It's a lot easier to reread 4 words just versus having to go back and reread like a whole passage all over again, especially when we get to like reading comprehension, right? So, yes, Ethan, if you could go back into this one and tell us what maybe you were thinking after each sentence before going on to the next one, okay?
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Awesome.
Renting cars from dealerships is less expensive than renting cars from national rental firms. So, renting cars from, I didn't even know you could rent a car from a local dealership, but
Yeah,
apparently
same.
that is according to the passage, and I'm going to take it as true. At
Yeah.
least until I see the questions, this is true. But to take advantage of dealership rates, tourists must determine which local dealership offers rentals, and then they must pay for long taxi rides between the airport and those dealerships. So, giving a little bit of logistical background as to what a tourist must endure in order to uh, indulge in this viable option.
Yep.
So renting from dealerships rather than national rental firms is generally more worthwhile for local residents than for tourists. So there is the conclusion. And so at least personally for me, because of my little practice with the LSAT, I like to break it down into chunks. I like to see um, what specifically in the passage or in these sentences is concrete, where I may challenge it, and then where the specific context, which I may have to compare and contrast with answers, with the potential answers, things I may notice or things I may clip as, oh, this may be this directly relates to the passage. Therefore, this answer may be more strong or is more likely to be right than the other four.
Yeah.
And, and
So,
so that's
oh, sorry, Ethan, go ahead.
I just wanted to let you speak this.
Okay. Before I ask my question, Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I guess I'm having trouble here determining how the premise supports the conclusion in this argument. How,
Yeah, and I
what does, riding a taxi have to do with anything involving the rates for the car rentals? You know what I'm saying?
yeah, okay, so I think you're having issue maybe with the second sentence here, but to take advantage of rates, they would need to determine which dealership offers rentals and then pay for a long taxi to get to those dealerships. So I think the author is trying to say here, like, hey, like these tourists, presumably, right? Like it's almost like we're having to assume for the author that these dealerships, like say it's a Ford dealership, like right, like your local Ford dealership in your hometown, in order to get from the airport to that Ford dealership, the tourist has to take an Uber to that Ford that's in like the outskirts of town, and it could be like a $75 Uber trip there, right? Where it's like, for example, if you traveled before, you may know that typically there are rental dealerships right outside of the airport. And this is kind of where we can maybe even pause after reading this and be like, huh, but like, yeah, we're going to grant this as true, but it's almost like the author is implicitly assuming here that they're one, that these dealerships are far enough away to where it would constitute an expensive Uber ride, and two, that there are car rental facilities close to or closer to these airports than the car dealerships.
Okay, I got you. Yeah, so that makes sense, but is he also concluding that even with the taxi ride to the dealership, you're still going to get a better deal for a better rate and it's worth taking the taxi? That's what he's saying, right?
So he's saying here, I think he's more it's almost like he switches up here in the last sentence, which I think can be kind of confusing. So he's saying that so hey, those people who would actually benefit from the cheaper rates of a dealership isn't tourist, it's local residents. And why is he saying that? He's saying, well, because for local tourists, they have to take long Uber rides. They don't even really know what dealerships offer those promotions. So therefore, yeah, dealerships offer good rates, but it's almost like the juice isn't worth the squeeze for the tourist. So he's concluding that, but it is good, or our local residents are the ones who can get a better deal from these dealerships versus our tourist here. So now I'm gonna jump back to Ethan. And Ethan, what do you think about that conclusion? Do you like it?
Well, I do like that the conclusion is simple and specifically one thing that may trip someone up is the fact that this specific answer is going from um, it's dealing from the tourist perspective, but at the end it makes a conclusion about local residents.
Uh-huh.
And so specifically when it comes to this last sentence, I would mainly focus on the part that says local resident. Again, it's more worthwhile for local residents than for tourists.
Yes.
So
Do you think that he proves to us that it is worthwhile for local residents? Because he hasn't really, who has he really been focused on throughout this whole passage? Has he been focused on local residents?
no, he's been focused on tourists.
Yeah. Has he given us any proof that local residents are getting a better bang for their buck when they go through a dealership versus a national rental firm?
Um, I wouldn't say so. No.
No, yeah, he hasn't at all, because who's it to say that these local residents aren't actually going through the same problem that these tourists are going through? Right, Ethan? Like, it's like, but these local residents, they could also not know, what type of deals that these local dealerships are giving out. Like, and another thing we could say is, what if these local dealerships only give these deals to local tourists, right? Like, what if they're, very specific in the promotion that they give out? What if it's like, "Hey, once you've used it once, you could, like, never use it again," or, "Hey, like, it's for any, people who have just flown into the San Diego airport, right, and are staying here for a few days, like, these are the people who can use our deals at our dealership." So what if those local residents aren't even allowed to use the deals at these dealerships? And also, what if these local residents live really far away, right? Like, what if they live in, like, bumfuck nowhere, like, in the outskirts of town, and they're having to go into town to get to these dealerships? It could be that those Uber rides to get into town, right? Because presumably they need a car since they need a rental. They need to go and Uber into town to get to those dealerships, and actually it's that, like, the airport car rental firms are much closer to local residents than those local dealerships are. So it's almost like he does a switch at the end where it's like he's really focused on, like, these tourists and why they are not, like, the primary group that he thinks would be able to get these deals, but he never really gives us evidence that local residents are able to get these deals either. And yeah, sorry, I think I had a few questions. Courtney, go ahead.
I think I got a little bit confused with the first sentence. I thought that was the conclusion, and then the last sentence I
Mm.
thought was an intermediate conclusion that
Hmm.
reinforced that first sentence.
Gotcha. Okay. So the first sentence here, it is kind of, it's a little ambiguous, right? Like when you first read it, because you're like, oh, is the author trying to argue this to us, or is this just something that we have to state as fact? And sometimes I will find like, hey, maybe I need to read on a little bit more to get a little bit more context on that first sentence. So totally okay and understandable that you kind of maybe were a little confused at first. I think when we read this first sentence, renting cars from dealerships is less expensive than renting cars from national rental firms. Okay. Is this something that the author is going to try to prove to us? Or is this just something that we're going to accept as true? It ends up being almost just like background information, right? Because then he keeps going on and he's like, and yeah, and like for tourists, I don't think that they actually get a good deal from these dealerships. So he never really gives us premises that help support that first sentence. It's more so that that first sentence helps support something else in the passage, which ends up being the very end of it. And that he's saying, like, okay, yeah, like car dealerships or renting cars from car dealerships is generally less expensive than renting them from car firms. But I don't think that tourists actually get that good of a deal from these dealerships.
Gotcha. Thank you
So,
so much.
yeah, so it's almost like he just gave that first sentence as like background context. Because his whole argument here, what he is trying to, like, Courtney, what would you think what is he trying to argue to us?
Okay, so I see where you're coming from. I read it as the main point is that renting from dealerships is cheaper than national rental firms. But renting from dealerships, that sentence was just reinforcing that conclusion and providing
Mm.
additional evidence.
I see. Interesting, yeah, 'cause you would almost have to read it as, like, if you really thought if the final sentence and did not end up being the main conclusion, it would have needed to sound like, renting from car dealerships rather than national rental firms is generally more worthwhile for local residents and for tourists. Therefore, renting cars from dealerships is less expensive than renting cars from national rental firms. Does that sound like that makes sense?
Yeah, so I would have needed that addition of that initial information at the end for
Yes.
it to be reinforcing that. I get it.
Yeah, yeah, so it's like when you do it that way, it doesn't make sense because it's almost like it contradicts itself. Because it's saying that first sentence is saying renting from car dealerships is less expensive than renting from national firms, but then the last sentence says, it brings up a new what? It brings up a whole new idea, which is local residents, where the author never, ever, ever talked about local residents anywhere else in the passage. So that's when you know when the author is bringing up this whole new, like, term, you're like, "What the fuck?" Like, he never told us anything about local residents in this passage at all. That's when you can kind of pinpoint and know, "Okay, now I'm ready to attack here," because we know nothing about local residents, and that too sometimes can help you figure out what the main point of a passage is. Nice. And yeah, this one's a tough one. I think it's gonna be a level 4 or level 5. So Ethan, can you read this one to us? And then I'll give everyone, I realize I'm a little over time. I'll give everyone about a minute to look through this one on yourself, and then we'll go through, this one together, okay?
What would you like for me to do?
Can you read this one to us and give us your light prediction of what you think the right answer choice could be?
And I'm supposed to read the answer, the potential
Um,
answers.
Read the question to
Read the
us.
question. Okay. Each of the following, if true, strengthens the argument except. So, um, at least in this case, I'm looking for. There's two ways you could go about it. You could look for the one that doesn't strengthen it, or you can look for all four that or for four which may potentially strengthen it, and then spot out the odd one out.
And what are we
So
trying to strengthen?
specifically, we're trying to strengthen the argument that renting from dealerships is more worthwhile for local residents than for tourists.
Exactly. So when we jump into these answer choices, we're looking for the one that either weakens that idea or does nothing, okay, because of the except here. So I'll give everyone, and I know this one was a lot. So thank you, Ethan, for analyzing this one for us. I'll give y'all about a minute or so to grapple with these answer choices yourself, and then we'll come back together again and talk about it, okay? Awesome. Okay, y'all. I'm gonna pull us back together here. And again, I realize I'm over time. So what I'm gonna do is, Ethan, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take this one for us just in case some people have to hop. But again, thank you so much for analyzing this passage. This was a tough one. So I appreciate you being brave and getting up on the platform here and speaking your thoughts to us. And if anyone has any questions along the way in this one, please feel free to stop me along the way here. But again, we're trying to strengthen, or I'm sorry, we're not trying to strengthen. We're trying to find the answer choice that either weakens or does nothing to the idea that renting from car dealerships is a better deal for local residents than it is for tourists. So I'm looking for an answer choice that's either like, hey, actually, these dealerships, they do not give promotions to local residents, right? Or actually, these local residents live a million miles away, and therefore they would have to get a really expensive ride to these dealerships, something along those lines. So again, right answer choice is either going to weaken or do absolutely nothing for this conclusion. So A says, to encourage future business, many car dealerships drop off and pick up rental cars for local residents at no charge. Oh gosh, okay, so that completely contradicts my whole just objection that I had here, right? Because if it's a fact that hey, local residents actually don't have to pay to get to these car dealerships, that is like that's something that they don't have to pay for, right? So yeah, maybe it is that these car dealerships are actually a good deal for these residents. B says tourists renting cars from national rental firms almost never need to pay for taxi rides to or from the airport. So I have to read this one again. Tourists renting cars from national rental firms almost never need to pay for taxi rides to or from the airport. Okay, so this also strengthens the author's conclusion because it's telling us that like, hey, when these tourists are looking at cars from rental facilities, they are either really close to those rental facilities or they don't have to pay because they can just maybe walk there, right? Because they are so close to the airport. So notice how it's like, it's kind of confirming this whole idea that like, but if they wanted to look at a dealership, they might have to drive a really far ways away to get to that dealership. But if they want to go to Alamo's right there at the airport. So super easy and convenient for these tourists to go there. So B ends up it ends up strengthening the author's reasoning. C says travel agents generally are unable to inform tourists of which local car dealerships offer rentals. And again, this confirms this whole fact that, hey, like these tourists, they may have a hard time figuring out what dealerships offer rentals. So it's like hard for them to know what the local deals are, and travel agents unfortunately can't even help them figure out what the local deals are. So that confirms the author's reasoning. D says many local residents know of local car dealerships that offer low priced rentals. So this is almost the flip of C, and it helps the same way because it's saying, hey, these tourists don't know about local deals, but these local residents do. These local residents do know what the local deals are for these dealerships. So both of them end up strengthening the argument in different ways. And then E here says for local residents, taxi rides to car dealerships from their homes or workplaces are usually no less expensive than taxi rides to national rental firms. And this one, gosh, I hate this answer choice, but this one I think is going to end up being the correct answer here because what it's saying is, and the no less is very important here. It's essentially saying, hey, I live in Toledo, Ohio, right? Like this is my hometown. I'm not a tourist here. I'm a local resident. My car breaks down, it goes to shit, and now I need to get a rental car. And I'm at work in downtown Toledo, and I need to take an Uber. So an Uber to the local Ford dealership to get a rental car is no less expensive than a taxi ride to the Alamo dealership at the Toledo airport. So what it's saying is that when it's saying no less expensive, it's saying it could either these no matter where I'm going, whether it's like an Uber to Ford dealership or whether it's an Uber to the Alamo rental facility, I'm either spending as much money on either one or or when I take an Uber to the Ford dealership, it's actually more expensive than taking an Uber to the Alamo rental facility. The no less expensive is important because it's essentially saying when something is no less expensive, that means it's either the same price or it is more expensive. So if we know it could be more expensive to take an Uber to the Ford dealership for me as a local, it starts to crumble the author's conclusion because remember the conclusion is that like local residents can get a better bang for their buck by going to that Ford dealership. But if it's either as expensive for me or even more expensive to take an Uber to the Ford dealership as a local than it would be to go to the Alamo rental facility, then it starts to question the author's conclusion a little bit here. And this one is yeah, the passage itself is hard and the correct answer choice is also it takes a second to grapple with it. Um Questions now because I know this one was a toughie. Does anyone have questions as to why I think E is going to be the correct answer here? Just reading through the chat as well. Nice. Okay. I do think E is going to end up being the correct answer choice here, and especially because I hated all the other ones too. That sometimes too can help you figure out like what the correct answer choice is going to be when you just hate all the others. And again, Ethan, I appreciate you going through this one with us. This one was a toughie, y'all. And again, these strengtheners, it's like E is like, oof, like it strengthens or it weakens just a little bit, right? Depending on how you look at it. So this is one where it's like it may take me a little second. It might take me a little bit longer to do this one versus one, right? That where I'm like it comes a little bit more naturally to me. The LSAT is not like one size fits all. There are going to be some questions that take a little bit longer than others for you. This is definitely one where I think I'd have to sit with for a little while for sure. All right, y'all. I am gonna end the recording here. And Sam, I saw you have a question. I'll answer that question. I'm just gonna end the recording and thank everyone for coming to class today. Thank you for staying over with me too. I do appreciate that. And maybe I will see y'all here soon. But again, and thank you to everyone who participated and asked such great questions as well. Have a good rest of your Saturday, everyone.